السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين ولا عدوان إلا على الظالمين والعاقبة للمتقين. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على عبدك ورسولك محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. So, inshallah ta'ala, today I wanted to reflect a bit on obviously what many people are seeing coming out of Minnesota, but I wanted to sort of step back and give this Quranic framing and really help us understand through the lens of the Quran the way that we deal with these types of situations beyond just the general statements about justice and the sin of racism and murder and brutality and all that comes from that, but really trying to understand deeply how the Quran teaches us to deal with a situation like this where we see murder, and when we see particularly state-sanctioned murder or murder that is repetitive coming out of a singular system, and what are some things that we can take from the Quran to understand this. And before I go any further, speaking about this, inshallah, I know that Islah LA is doing something today, inshallah, so I shared it on Instagram. I know that they're doing something in a few hours, and I think it would be important for all of us to tune in and to hear what our imams and various activists have to say about the current situation and how we can deal with the situation. But it is important for us to really have a spiritual framing beyond just the devastating impact of watching yet another video of a modern-day lynching, police lynching, the way that we see with George Floyd. And it's unacceptable for us to simply once again say, it's unfortunate, it's a mistake, it shouldn't have happened, but these are the types of things that happen in this line of work, and there's nothing that we can do about it. I think that it's also extremely faulty for a person to step in and to express a greater sense of outrage over property damage and looting and things that happen in the wake of this. Or the extreme forms of the reaction, because to paint the entire protest as rioting has implications, and then to speak about just one element of it has implications. I think that it's also unjust to the situation. And so I wanted us to just pull back and to reflect on 5 verses of the Quran that speak about justice and particularly the darkness of the injustice that covers a society when murder of this regard at the hands of the state is glossed over and is not dealt with properly. And so the first thing is just to speak about how the gravity of one murder can really shift a current, both in terms of its laws and in terms of its society, if people deal with it in a proper way. And this is something that we even find from the Quran. You'll see that there is a frequent quote from the Quran that whoever saves one life, it is as if he has saved all of mankind. And that is taken from Surah Al-Ma'idah. And Surah Al-Ma'idah does not just introduce this ayah, does not just introduce this verse out of nowhere. It actually introduces it coming out of the story of Cain and Abel, the story of Qabil and Habil, where Allah tells us about how one brother murders another brother, the first murder in the history of mankind. And he murders his brother not because of something that the brother did wrong, but because of an insecurity within himself, because his sacrifice was not accepted. And the only way that he felt like he could assert his power was to take his brother's life, was to murder his brother. Not to say to Allah, why was my sacrifice not accepted in that? What can I do to make my sacrifice accepted? But instead to kill his brother. And that is something that I'll probably elaborate on in a future time. But usually when a person commits these types of acts, they have problems with themselves more than they have with the world around them. And so they project their own insecurities on the world around them. And in this situation where you have one brother, the first murder in mankind, one brother who murders his brother, who did no wrongdoing, who did nothing to deserve to be killed, Allah then introduces, مِنْ أَجْلِ ذَلِكَ كَتَبْنَا عَلَى بَنِي إِسْرَائِيل. It was because of that we prescribed on Bani Israel that whoever kills one person, not in retaliation of murder or injustice, but or to spread mischief in the land, it would be as if he killed all of mankind, and whoever saves one life, it is as if he saves all of mankind. So من قتل نفسا بغير نفس أو فساد في الأرض فكأنما قتل الناس جميعا ومن أحياها فكأنما أحيا الناس جميعا. That whoever kills one person, not in retaliation of murder or the spreading of mischief in land, but it would be as if that person killed all of mankind, and whoever saves one life, it would be as if he saved the life of all of mankind. And subhanAllah, what you see here is an entire law, that entire laws can come out of one murder, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says He prescribed this on the children of Israel, arising out of this incident, arising out of what happened here, that murder of one person in injustice is like the murder of all of mankind, is like killing all of mankind. And to save one life is like saving all of mankind. So the gravity of one murder here is able to dictate or transitions in the discourse of the Quran from just the murder of one person to how an entire nation is then given a law of justice on how to deal with murder. Particularly when it comes to the unjust killing of someone who had nothing, who did not do anything that was deserving of such a crime. Allah Azza wa Jal also teaches us through the tongue of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that the gravity of one murder is such that it can shift societies, and in that case, the one who sets the trend is responsible for everything that arises out of that trend. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ, peace be upon him, he said that no one commits murder except that the first murderer, being the brother in Qabil and Habil, has a share of that evil because of how, لِأَنَّهُ أَوَّلَ مَنْ سَنَّ الْقَتْلِ, because he's the first one to normalize murder. And so anytime anyone kills, a share of that evil goes to the first killer, because there's a trend that is set. Then it sets off something that ends up becoming much larger than its initial occurrence. And so there's this idea, subhanAllah, of the gravity of one murder, the sanctity of one life, and the gravity of one murder, and how that should cause a society to pause and to reflect on where we have come. Now, in the case of police brutality, of course, this isn't just one murder. There are thousands of hashtags at this point. And before hashtags were a thing, there were thousands of victims of the same nature, the same type of murder. So, how does the Quran talk about this idea of justice and this idea of the presence of justice for the victim? Not just dealing with, obviously, the spiritual disease of racism, and then what that manifests itself in terms of the systemic oppression of a people on the basis of their color and everything that comes out of that. But life that exists, or life that comes out of a presence of justice. What happens in a society when justice is there? A frequent statement from Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, إن الله لا يقيم الدولة العادلة وإن كانت كافرة ويهدم الدولة الظالمة وإن كانت مسلمة, that Allah would uphold a just nation even if that nation was a disbelieving nation, and Allah would destroy an oppressive nation even if that nation was a Muslim nation. There's something to be said about the presence of justice in a society and what that does to a society, and particularly one element of justice, which is empowering the victims of injustice. Empowering the victims of injustice, which sends a clear message to future aggressors and oppressors, current and future aggressors and oppressors, and also establishes a system where people who have been wronged consistently, people that have been wronged consistently, have a legal mechanism to be able to go forth and to attain justice. Now, in Islam, that was called qisas. That's called qisas, which is retribution, the legal retribution that exists when a life is taken. And so, in the case of qisas, the plaintiff, the victim is the plaintiff, and of course, or the family of the victim is the plaintiff, and the plaintiff is actually the one that has the authority of retribution, right? To decide what to do with the one that has taken the life of their loved one, and to choose without being pressured in a way that, or it cannot be a superficial choice, right? We see this happen all the time where in the name of qisas, you have a state that would pressure a family to forgive the killers, to forgive the murderers, because that would cover the state, right? No, this is a pure idea of qisas that exists in the Quran, where the family actually has the right to decide the fate of the one that took their loved one. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about this, وَلَكُمْ فِي الْقِصَاصِ حَيَاةٌ يَا أُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. And this is what I want to focus on, the spiritual part of this, that you have life in legal retribution, that there is hayat, that there is life in the presence of justice, a mechanism of justice for the family of those that have been wronged. Ya ulil albab la'allakum tattaqun, O people of understanding, that you may become righteous. Now, this is a very specific wording that we find in this verse. Lakum fil qisasi haya, that you have in the presence of a system that would allow for a person that would allow for the family of the victims to actually have rights, to have the legal rights to pursue justice, that there is life in that. And the way that scholars traditionally dealt with this, so you read the tafsir of this ayah. One tafsir of it, which the scholars mention, is that if a killer knows that there would be retribution for their killing, then that person would think before they murder, and so they would hold themselves back from killing. And in the case of that, al-hayat here, life that's preserved, the traditional scholars, or traditionally you'll find in the tafsir, they'll say that hayat, in that the life of the murdered and the potential murderer and the potential murdered is saved, because the presence of justice, the presence of a system that would deter someone from killing, that would hold someone back from killing, gives life to the one that was going to be killed, and the person who would have taken that life and then suffer the consequences of that. And so qisas prevents, right, the empowering of the plaintiff, the empowering of the victim's family prevents that. And qisas would be applied not in a way that if a person, one of the things that Islam came to do away with was tribalism, right? So it didn't matter if you belonged to Banu Makhzum, which was one of the more powerful tribes of Mecca, or if you belonged to no tribe at all, right? The idea was that qisas would be established in a way that it would deter a person from killing, because they knew that there was going to be a system of accountability. And in the process of that, that's why you'll find the statement of Imam Hassan Basri, rahimahullah, the life of the potential murderer and the life of the potential murdered one is saved. But there's a societal element to this as well that goes beyond just the case of that person, because we said there's the gravity of one murder and the sanctity of one life. And subhanAllah, there's a very beautiful discourse. Sheikh Yasir Fahmi had shared this quote from Muhammad Abu Zahra, rahimahullah ta'ala, where he talked about a dignified existence. That life here is not just talking about the presence of people being able to live and to breathe, but it's speaking about the idea of a dignified existence, that a society in which lives are sanctified, in which there is proper recourse when murder takes place, that gives that society a sense of a noble life, a dignified existence, a dignified societal life. And when those mechanisms are not there, then they die as a society due to injustice, the presence of dhulm, the cloud of dhulm and injustice that ends up covering that entire society. And so it's not just the life of one person that's saved, but it is what ends up taking place of murder that spreads throughout the land, because there is no recourse, because there are clear double standards. And particularly the worst type here is when the state itself, when the authority, which is supposed to be in a place of holding accountable, is what needs to be held accountable because of the constant murder that's coming from that singular place. And so Muhammad Abu Zahra rahimahullah spoke about this from a societal perspective, that there is life in society, that there's haya in society, when there is a legal recourse, for these types of actions, because it doesn't allow murder to go unchecked, and tughyan, dhulm, oppression, and these types of things to go unchecked. And I want us to think about this, because it's very important for us to be self-critical about where we are right now, and to just think about where we're at in terms of history. When you have George Zimmerman, And I don't know where I was reading this earlier today, but just about the money that George Zimmerman has made uh, after murdering Trayvon Martin and not being held accountable. Right? So I'm not going to rehash the details of the murder of Trayvon Martin, but obviously it was instrumental in the starting of the Black Lives Matter movement. And George Zimmerman, has accumulated. He not only got away with murder, but he's accumulated hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe over $1 million, right? But hundreds of thousands of dollars for sure, being celebrated for that murder. And I want you to think about what this is like, right? And it should sicken you, right? When George Zimmerman, who took the life of that young Trayvon Martin, is able to walk around and go to conventions around the country and be treated like a celebrity, sign autographs for money, sold his gun, the gun that he used to kill Trayvon Martin. He was able to auction it off for over $100,000, and then sue the parents for defamation, right? And make money off of that. What type of message does that send to society, right? To other racists in society. Oh, and by the way, he also did a commercial with a gun store owner in Florida, I believe, who had the "No Muslims Allowed" sign on his store. Some cheap marketing tactic, I guess. He put "No Muslims Allowed" on his gun shop, and George Zimmerman went and did a commercial with him. Allah knows how much he got paid to do that. But like, what type of a society, right? What type of a message does that send to society? Where's the hayat? Like, where's the life in our society in that sense, right? And then you see these videos of the murder of Ahmaud Arbery and the lynching of Ahmaud Arbery and what that leads to, right? And there was something about that video, the lynching of Ahmaud Arbery, that was particularly gross, because you could tell that the people that were committing this murder had no fear whatsoever of the repercussions of their murder, right? And had the outrage not been there, they probably would have never been charged, because the videos were shown to those that could have taken legal action in their hands, but all of that was brushed under the rug and nothing happened as a result of that. And so due to the outrage, eventually, and we'll see where that goes, because justice has not actually yet been served in that case. But the point is that there was no fear of accountability. There is an understanding that we're going to get away with this. And then you see what happens in Minnesota with George Floyd, and the arrogance in the eyes of that cop as he puts his knee on the neck of George Floyd, a man pleading for his life, calling for his mother, right, in his last moments, his mother who died 2 years ago. And you see the arrogance and the sense of invincibility in the eyes of that person and the eyes of the officers that are standing around. And you wonder, well, those officers probably knew the officer that murdered Philando Castile in his car in front of his 4-year-old daughter, who for doing absolutely nothing, right? Philando Castile, who was driving, pulled over, was following instructions, and shot 7 times in front of his 4-year-old daughter. That's coming out of the same police department. What is that? What message does that send to other officers in terms of the ability to get away with these types of things? I'm not going to go through all of the incidents because there are too many to name. But we have to start to think about this idea of وَلَكُمْ فِي الْقِصَاصِ حَيَاةٌ يَا أُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ, this idea of what the presence or the absence in this situation of justice does to the murderer, to the psyche of potential murderers, to the psyche of a person that does have a uniform and a gun, and doesn't feel like they're going to be held accountable if they murder people, because there's always a way, right? I mean, and we have a history of planting evidence. We have a history of all sorts of ways where people are able to get out of these things. What is the message that's being sent, right? And from a societal perspective, to those in authority as well. So it's not just the George Zimmermans of the world, but it's also for us to think about what this means in terms of society as a whole. And then I want to end with one verse here, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا النَّفْسَ الَّتِي حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ إِلَّا بِالْحَقِّ وَمَنْ قُتِلَ مَظْلُومًا فَقَدْ جَعَلْنَا لِوَلِيِّهِ سُلْطَانًا فَلَا يُسْرِفْ فِي الْقَتْلِ إِنَّهُ كَانَ مَنْصُورًا. This is a verse in Surah Al-Isra. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and I'm going to read it again very slowly, وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا النَّفْسَ الَّتِي حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ إِلَّا بِالْحَقِّ. And do not kill the soul that God has forbidden except in justice. وَمَنْ قُتِلَ مَظْلُومًا. And so whoever is killed unjustly, then we have given, فَقَدْ جَعَلْنَا لِوَلِيهِ سُلْطَانًا. We have given to the family, or to the inheritor, or to whoever is left to represent that person that's been killed, we have given them sultana. SubhanAllah, we've given them authority. We've given them authority. They're in a place of power. They're in a place of power. They are fully empowered to demand retribution or justice, or to show mercy. The mercy should not be weaponized the way that it was here in Dallas. The weaponizing of the forgiveness of the brother of Botham John against the mother of Botham John, the family of Botham John, right? A beautiful act of mercy and forgiveness was weaponized against the family that was still calling for justice. Okay? Here, Allah is saying we have given to the wali sultana, we've given them authority, we've given them power. They're in a place of power. They're in a place of authority. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَلَا يُسْرِفْ فِي الْقَتْلِ. And do not exceed the limits in the matter of taking justice. إِنَّهُ كَانَ مَنْصُورًا. And verily, that person has been supported, that person has been helped. Now, I'm going to break this down for a bit. First of all, before Allah gets to the injustice in the response, Allah affirms the complete authority of the victim, the right of the victim, and in this case, when a victim has been killed, the family of the victim, the rights of them. Using the word sultana is not easy, that they have authority. They are in a place where they have authority. The state is to carry out what the family wants due to the injustice that they have incurred. Okay? And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَلَا يُسْرِفْ فِي الْقَتْلِ. And do not exceed bounds. And just look at the order of the verse. Okay, look at the order of the verse. If you only talk about فَلَا يُسْرِفْ فِي الْقَتْلِ, if you talk about the excessiveness in the response, without talking about the glaring void of the presence of justice, and how that has been compounded over time, and what you have with a community that is fed up, that is sick of being treated this way, that has been beaten over the head by this so-called justice system for as many years as it's existed. And you think about going back to that verse, وَلَكُمْ فِي الْقِصَاصِ حَيَاتٌ يَا أُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ, that there is life in the presence of justice, and death. It's just society suffocates when there's injustice. It's absolutely heartbreaking. And I've seen many mothers of the victims of police brutality, and the pain and despair in their eyes, and it's beyond devastating to watch the mother of a child that's been killed unjustly, and they have absolutely no way to make sense of what has happened, right? And they're in the spotlight for a few weeks, a few months, and then usually the case is dropped, there is no justice, and the family just disappears into despair, and no one is around the family anymore. No one really asks about the families of the victims of police brutality months after, years after, once the case has sort of moved on and people have moved on. No one really asks about them anymore. In this situation, though, I do want us to think about this, right? Like every time you're watching another Black political commentator, a mother or a father, break down into tears on TV, all right? And you ask yourself, what is it that is making people so fed up, right? And just the compounded sense of injustice, which is valid, right? We have to ask ourselves, where are we as a society? And then Allah says, فَلَا يُسْرِفْ فِي الْقَتْلِ. Do not exceed in the response. So yes, فَلَا يُسْرِفْ فِي الْقَتْلِ is there. Do not exceed in the response. That's there. Do not exceed in the response is there. But before do not exceed in the response is there, affirming the full right of the victim and the families of the victim is also there. And you can't just jump that. So you have to take the ayah as a whole, and the way that it ends, إِنَّهُ كَانَ مَنْصُورًا, indeed he will be supported. Now, indeed he will be supported here, according to the majority of the Mufassirin, if not all of them, is not talking about divine aid here. It's talking about the state supporting the family of the victim. So you'll find Dafr al-Imam, the authority supporting the family of the victim fully, without any holding back. So, the way the scholars spoke about this, they said, even if the person who justice is being exacted against is a friend of the authority, if that wouldn't excuse that person because of conflict of interest or whatever it may be, but whatever it is, that there is a way forward, that the imam, that the authority is to exact justice, innahu kana mansura, and Allah comforting the family of the victim by saying that the authority will have your back, right? The authority will have your back, that the state will have your back, the governor will have your back, the imam will have your back, whoever it is. But the point is that you will be mansura, you are to be helped, you are to be supported in your cause. There's so much to unpack here, but just taking the three critical components from this, Allah first starts off with the sanctity, or four critical components just of this ayah. Allah starts off with the sanctity of one person, the sanctity of one human life. And then secondly, and by the way, that's important because, as I said, in the immediate wake of this, and we saw this with Stefan Clark, particularly, and so many of these different cases, right? The character assassination that takes place after the murder of a person at the hands of the police, the character assassination is to desensitize us, is to impress upon us that this person is not worth your love and outrage. They're not worth you fighting for them. They're not worth, what was that person's value to society in the first place? So why should Black death matter if Black life doesn't matter? Why should we care about this person? And so the barrage of character assassinations that happen against the victim after they're dead and can't speak for themselves is meant to neutralize our response, neutralize our anger, neutralize our outrage, and just say, well, is it really that sacred of a person? Is that really that sacred of a life? Right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says here that the nafs, haram Allah, that Allah has sanctified the soul. Allah has sanctified that life. You don't have a right to say that this life has more value than another. Based on anything, based on race, based on record, based on anything. You don't have that right to say that this life does not matter. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala starts off with that. And then, وَمَنْ قُتِلَ مَظْلُومًا, Allah starts with the second component, the one who is killed unjustly. Then their family should have complete authority. Sultana, their family should have the complete right. The third thing, and then the family, or then the rightful heirs, those that are angered by the injustice, should not become unjust themselves or exceed the bounds in seeking justice. And then, innahu kana mansura, that person is supposed to be helped by the authority in their cause. Here, instead, we find these layers of systemic injustice, where you have, the DA's office and the police department and a racist president, and all of these elements working hand in hand with one another to suffocate the calls for justice and to suffocate the families of those victims. And it's a terrible combination that we have. Now, where do we leave off from all of this? And again, I'm going to recommend to everyone to pay attention to, I think Al-Islah LA has a program, I believe in an hour or so, inshallah. You can find it on their page on Instagram. It's important for us to recognize the aggregate societal impact of this and what it means for us, and to really help our entire society to be more introspective as we are also calling for reform, for justice for those victims. We're calling for the reform of a system that continues to render injustice, and we're calling for the rights of those victims and the families of those victims of this injustice. But we also need to be introspective and to ask ourselves, what is it about our society, and how do we work through all of these layers, the spiritual diseases that exist here, the enshrined legal injustices that exist here, and the constant negligence of the families of these victims. And that's probably the last thing that I'll end on, because it's the most human of it all, in terms of the inequity of pain, right? That when these families, the family of Botham John, who was murdered, by an officer sitting on his couch, watching Thursday night football, eating ice cream, watching Thursday night football because the officer walked in the wrong apartment. And the murder of Tatiana Jefferson, just a few miles away from here in Fort Worth, a woman who shared a driveway with the masjid in Fort Worth while she was playing a video game with her nephew, and was shot through the window by an officer. And subhanAllah, the pain of that, by the way, both her mom and her dad have since died. Both her mother and her father have since died. And there's something to be said about the pain that it caused that family to lose a Tatiana Jefferson, and the fact that there still has not been justice served in that case, by the way. So it's important for us to not relinquish these things when the media moves on, just as when we talk about any cause, any global cause. Our brothers and sisters that languish as political prisoners in places around the world, whether that's here in the United States or whether that is overseas. Our mashayikh, our teachers, our scholars, our brothers, our sisters that are wrongfully accused and that languish as political prisoners. The constant murder and rampage that takes place in different parts of the world, the drones that were that drop on our brothers and sisters around the world, the Uyghurs, the Palestinians, the Syrians, Afghanistan, which is constantly being hit over and over and over again by horrible attacks and things that are happening there. Just as we don't turn a blind eye, we cannot turn a blind eye to those things just because the media has moved on or just because it's no longer popular. Let's also not turn a blind eye, inshallah, to the families of these victims and to the calls for justice, and then wait for another hashtag to say something else. And there are going to be plenty of hashtags all the time, unfortunately, until we're able to actually lend our voices towards this. And we pray that Allah allow us to be used for good. And we pray that Allah make things easy for those that are suffering in multiple ways as a result of this. Every family of a victim and every black parent in America that has to have a conversation with their kids right now about this, about what they're seeing unfold. We pray for them and we lend our support to them in any way that we possibly can, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. If I've said anything wrong, it is from myself, from the shaitan. I seek Allah's forgiveness and I seek refuge from him. Or in him from the shaitan, and if I've said anything right, then it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. اللهم وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.